Good evening, Raleigh Road Baptist Church. We're going to continue on our study of the apostles tonight by discussing part 2 of the apostle Mark, who, as we know, wrote the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament. Tonight's lesson, part 2 of Mark, is divided into 6 sections. So let's begin with section number 1, called Peter's Interpreter. Peter's Interpreter. The church historian Papias writes that Mark served as Peter's interpreter, which means that Mark served as a translator between foreign languages for Peter. Since Peter was just an average fisherman who had only a very modest education, and his native language was Aramaic, it's very probable that Peter spoke very little Greek, and what little he did speak probably wasn't very good. Therefore, to speak or write in the Greek language, which was the main language of the known world at that time, was nearly impossible for Peter to do. However, we discover that Mark, who came from a very wealthy family and who was well educated, that Mark spoke and wrote Greek fluently. So it seems that one of Mark's main jobs with Peter was to help translate Greek for him and to help him write his books, 1st and 2nd Peter, in Greek. So Mark, it is thought by just about all church historians, started out in his association with Peter as Peter's foreign language interpreter. All right, in part 2, we're going to look at Mark's method of writing. Again, the church historian Papias records that since Mark was not one of the original disciples and could not therefore record Jesus' words from memory because he didn't hear them, he got his information, as we've mentioned before, from a man who did hear them, the Apostle Peter. It was said that Peter and all the other 11 apostles could recall Jesus' life with what is known as apostolic authority. That means they were the only 12 alive who were there when Jesus said these things. What Mark did was when Peter would tell him about the things that Jesus said and did, Mark would write them down. He'd write down an account of everything that Peter remembered. Now, probably as he wrote it down, he was not writing it down in chronological order of the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, because probably Peter just told him things that would come into his mind each day. So later on, when he got ready to write his gospel, Mark had to sit down and edit the notes he had taken from Peter and organize them into correct chronological order from the beginning to the middle to the end. So Mark's method then of getting the material he needed to write his gospel was taking notes each day from what Peter had to say about Jesus, because Mark himself was not an apostle like Peter was, and he did not hear Jesus say these things. He didn't see him do these things that Peter saw and heard. All right, in part 3 tonight, we're going to take a look at Mark in Egypt. In Egypt, there is probably what we would call a legend that Mark was the bishop of the Christian church in Alexandria, Egypt. In other words, if we bring it into today's modern Baptist connotation, he was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Alexandria. Even a church historian as famous as Eusebius wrote in his highly read book called Church History that Mark was the first apostle to go to Egypt, and that Mark proclaimed the gospel which he had written and established Christian churches in Alexandria. Now, Mark is said by Eusebius, excuse me, and some other church fathers. Remember, the church fathers were the early pastors of the large churches. Mark was said by Eusebius, the church historian, and other church fathers to be the first bishop of Alexandria. However, not all Christian historians believe this to be true, but it is evident that some early Christians did associate Mark with being in Egypt. However, this may be where that came from. Around the 3rd century, toward the end of the 3rd century, between 290 and 300 AD, a group of Christians in Alexandria, in an effort to enhance and build up the reputation of their church, claimed that their church had a connection to one of the original biblical apostles. The question might be here, if what they are doing was not true, if they were just making it up to make their church look more famous, why did they choose Mark? Not that Mark is not famous today, but Mark in that day wasn't as famous as he is today. He wasn't one of the original apostles, for example. So if you're going to make something up to make your church look impressive, and you're going to choose one of the apostles to be the one that had a direct connection with your church, that maybe started your church back in the days of the early Christian church, why don't you pick one of the original 12? Why Mark? That's the question. So therefore, if Mark was never in Egypt, if he was never in Alexandria, why did this church pick him as their connection to the early days of the Christian church, as their connection to the early followers of Jesus? Well, my take on it is this. I believe Mark did go to Alexandria. I believe he did establish the first Christian church there, because if I was on a jury and we were ruling on whether or not Mark was in Alexandria from the evidence we just went over, I think the evidence points to the fact that he was probably there, that he probably did establish the first Christian church. Because if you're going to tell a lie and you're going to connect your church to a famous Christian figure, it wouldn't be Mark, it would be one of the original 12 apostles. So the fact that they did connect themselves with Mark makes me believe that he really was there. So Mark was probably in Egypt. He probably started churches there. He was probably the first bishop of Alexandria. However, there are still those who disagree. So the next section is called On Shaky Ground. Let's see what you think here. Let you make your own decision. The truth is, in world history and Christian history, we know very little about what went on in Alexandria in the first 150 years after the time of Christ. So from about 33 AD until about 180 AD, we don't know much about what went on in Alexandria at all. Most of what has been written down has been passed down orally from mouth to mouth, and we're not sure whether it was true. There were two very famous writers, Christian writers, who lived in Alexandria. Their names were Clement and Origen. Clement and Origen were two of the later, in the 300s AD, 300 to 400 AD. They were two of the later church writers after Papias and Eusebius. They came along later. And they became very famous. I studied them in church history when I was in divinity school at Cameron. Do you know that Clement and Origen, who were from Alexandria, made no mention whatsoever of Mark in their writings? Now, what does that lead you to believe? Someone who had started the Christian church in Alexandria and was called the first bishop of Alexandria, like Mark was, by earlier church historians, was not even mentioned by Origen and Clement. At about the same time that they wrote, there was the famous church historian from Africa named Tertullian. Tertullian said nothing about any of the 12 apostles or any of the other apostles after them ever visiting Alexandria. Never mentioned it. So, what have we got here? What we've got is the earliest Christian writers saying he was there. Later Christian writers not saying he wasn't there, but not even mentioning any of the apostles being there. So what do we come down with at the end here? We cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mark was in Egypt. We cannot prove that he was the first bishop of the first Christian church in Alexandria. He may have visited there, but we don't have any evidence that if he did go there, that he was there for a long time. We don't have any evidence that he was killed there and became a martyr there. We don't have any evidence that he was buried there. All we have are the writings of some of the earliest church historians that he was there. However, those earlier church historians, remember, were closer to the time of the original apostles, Papias and Eusebius. Although they did not talk to the original apostles who were dead by then, they did talk to people who had talked to them. Whereas Clement and Origen and Tertullian came along 100 years later. So if I was going to bet my money on the earliest Christian writers, or the ones that came along in the 300s AD, I'm going to put my money on the earliest guys who talked to the people who had talked to the original disciples. So once again, I say it is my belief that Mark was in Alexandria. Part 5 takes us from Alexandria to Rome. If Mark didn't write his gospel in Alexandria, and a lot of people think he did, where did he write it? Well, where's the next good possible place he could have written the Gospel of Mark? Well, the next place that historical evidence suggests is Rome. Now, let's look at some reasons why it might have been Rome. Paul wrote his gospel in Latin. Now, why would he write it in Latin? Well, the reasoning goes there. He wrote it in Latin because he was living in Rome at the time and he was writing it for a Roman audience because these people spoke Latin. Rome, as we know from the book of Romans, was an early Christian focal point. The apostles felt like if they could bring Christianity to Rome, then it would filter out from there to the rest of the world. So Rome was an early Christian focal point. Mark would have had ample opportunities there to collect first-hand stories about Jesus, not only from Peter, who was imprisoned and killed there, but from Paul, who was imprisoned and killed there, but many other Christians who either lived there or visited there. You see, Rome was kind of like New York City is to us today. A lot of people who didn't live there still came there on vacations and had family there and stayed a while. And Paul had ample opportunity to talk to hundreds of Christians about what they had heard about Jesus. Remember also, in the Gospels, we hear about the 12 disciples. But Jesus had a lot more than 12 disciples. There were just 12 that traveled with him everywhere he went. But he had more than that. He had 72 disciples in the Gospels that he sent out on an evangelistic mission. When Jesus rose from the dead, Paul says he spoke to 500 of his disciples at one time. Some of these people would have surely been available to Mark over the years, providing material to him to round out what Peter and Paul had told him. So although Mark's gospel seems to have used primarily what Peter told him for the core of the gospel, there's no doubt that other people contributed to Mark's information as well as Peter. So was Mark in Rome? Obviously he was. Did he write his gospel there? Good chance that he did. All right, part 6 tonight, as we'll close out tonight's lessons, a little shorter than last week's. I did about 2/3 of my information on Mark last week, and I'm doing about 1/3 this week. When did Mark write his gospel? When? The church historian Papias indicated that Mark got his information from Peter, which meant that he got it while Peter was still alive, of course, during Peter's lifetime. So, in the years leading up to the early 60s, 61 and 62 AD, remember we said that Mark was serving as Peter's foreign language interpreter because Peter could not speak or write Greek very well. So it seems like in those years that he was serving as Peter's foreign language interpreter is when Mark started writing his gospel. Remember, as I've mentioned before, Mark was actually in Rome when Peter and Paul were executed. About the time we think that they were executed is when Mark started writing his gospel. This gospel was to serve as the first fixed record about Jesus Christ for the second generation of Christians. Now, if Mark wrote his gospel in the early 60s, by the time the next group of people who were to read it got it, it was mass produced and they got it in their hands. Remember, they didn't have any printing presses in those days. Everything was written by hand, so it took a long time to write enough of these things for them to get around for every church to have one. So by the time that Mark wrote his gospel, edited his gospel, and then got it out into circulation so people could copy it and each church could have one, it's probably 20 or 30 years, which meant the second generation of Christians was coming along. And they read Mark's gospel, which was the first gospel written. In fact, there was no term then called gospel, except that was the name that Christians applied to Christian teaching. Nobody called Mark's gospel back in that day the first gospel. It was only after all 4 of them had been written that Christians began to refer to these 4 books That's the four Gospels. Other Gospels, of course, soon followed. It's thought that Matthew was second, Luke was probably third, and John, we know John was last because his was written in the early 90s AD, whereas Mark, Luke, and Matthew were all written, we think, in the 60s. These Gospels, with Mark's being the first, brought millions of people to a saving grace in Jesus Christ. And so Mark, the young fellow who started out so poorly in Christian ministry, ended up being one of the most famous apostles of all time. Okay. Let's see now. We've done Matthew, we've done Peter, we've done Mark. I can't remember if we've done Luke. I don't think we have. If we haven't done Luke, I'll do him next week. If I discover that I'm wrong, I'll do another one, but I'm not sure which one that'll be right now. Thank you for listening. I hope you're having a great week. Hope to see you Sunday morning, 9:30, under the trees at Raleigh Road Baptist Church. God bless and good night.